sometimes Jezebel happens. So my wife and I and our kids lived for 4 years in the Middle East. And overall, we had a great experience there. Like, we loved the culture, we loved the people, I loved the food. It was just an awesome experience for us. We had this little house that we lived in. It was perfect for us while we lived there, and it had a great view, and it was really close to areas where we could be close to local people. It was great, but there was this cat, and it would just like waltz onto our property. It was not our cat. It was just a cat. I don't like cats. I'm with Tom, right? I kind of hate them, okay? Now, some of you are cat people, and that is okay. I just don't understand you. And this cat was kind of the worst, right? Like it would tear up anything we left outside. It would like pee on my stuff, and it would glare at me. I know maybe it doesn't seem like cats can glare, but this cat would glare. It would like look at me, just glare. The nerve, right? I mean, I think if this cat had a name, it would be Jezebel. Anyway, okay, so one night while we were living overseas, my wife and I go out on a date. We didn't get to take dates very much, so we had a lot of kids. But we got some friends to watch our kids. We went out. It was a fantastic evening. Like, we just had a great time, reconnected. So we come back home late that night, and as I'm going to walk into my house, I smell the smell of gas and hear something coming from the inside. I open up the door and I step into water. This isn't good, right? It took us actually a few days to figure out what had happened, but here's what had gone on. When we had first moved in, there were a couple of propane camping tanks, right? You know, like the little ones you go camping with, that were just left there in the place. And so I had taken those and shoved them in a small little closet, cabinet in our laundry room. Well, that little cabinet also housed our water heater. Well, what had happened is our water heater was so old that the temperature gauge had broken on it, and so it just started heating the water and then heating and heating and heating until it was boiling, and then it just kept going. Well, the hose connecting it to the house line was so old as well that after boiling water had been running through it long enough, it just like melted. And then it started spewing boiling hot water out of the water heater into the cabinet and onto these propane tanks. Well, that goes on for long enough, it builds up enough pressure, and the propane tanks exploded. They blew the doors off of the cabinet, and then water is just like dumping into our laundry room. And by the time we got home, it had like come all the way to the front door. I was not very happy. I called my friend, and I was like, dude, I'm really sorry it's so late, but please can you come over and help us bail water? So we put our kids down, and then my wife and I and my friend just started getting cups and buckets and taking water and trying to take it outside, figure out what we could do. And man, that whole time I was so grumpy. I was like taking a bucket and throwing it outside. I'm coming back, I don't know, getting another bucket and taking it outside. All right, well, about an hour and a half into this, as we're doing it, we're all just kind of working away. I get a bucket full of water and I turn around, and guess who's standing in our hallway? Jezebel. In that moment, I felt the righteous indignation rise up within me. I was livid. I actually think I was shaking. And I walked over to that cat, and I took my finger, and I pointed it in its glaring little face, and I said, "Not today, cat." And then I picked it up, and I walked outside, and I set it down, and then I walked back in. And when I walked back in, my wife and friend are just like keeled over laughing. I was like, "What are you guys laughing at?" They're like, "Wow, John, that's the best you've got. Not today, cat." Like, watch out, guys, John's angry. Those are his angry words. I was like, guys, shut up, all right? I don't want to talk about it. But sometimes you know what that's like. Things are going so well, and then Jezebel. That's where we find ourselves in the story with Elijah. If you want to open up to 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah, I mean, he's had a pretty sweet spot. I mean, think about some of the things that Elijah has got to witness, right? God sent a drought at his command. He was fed by ravens in the wilderness. He watched an endless supply of flour and oil. He watched God raise somebody from the dead. And then at Elijah's command, he sent fire that consumed an altar. Like, I will take any one of those in my life and I'll be good. right? Like how many times have you prayed like, Lord, please demonstrate your almighty power to all of my friends. If you wanted to like send a bolt of lightning, maybe just happen to hit that kid who just shoved me into a locker, that would be awesome. This is amazing. But more than that, like Elijah has taken charge of the situation. Like after the prophets of Baal were found to be false prophets, he kills them. Like they were found to be guilty of a capital crime, and so he carries out capital punishment. I mean, Elijah, this is like his golden moment here. He has proven once and for all that Yahweh is God. And then Jezebel finds out, and she is ticked. Now, why is Jezebel so angry? Well, remember, Jezebel worshiped Baal, and I think these prophets were her boys, right? Like she had a plan for them. They were going to run the transition to a Yahweh-less society. And now Elijah has gone just like that and ruined her whole plan. She is fuming mad. And so she sends word to Elijah. May the gods do so to me, and more also, if your life is not like one of them by this time tomorrow. Ooh. Now, a couple of issues with what she says. So she says, like, as my gods live, like she makes a threat based on like the living of her gods. It's like, well, you know, Elijah, like that whole thing with the prophets, like the point of that was kind of like your gods don't live. So I hate to say it, but it's kind of an empty threat. And then the second point, like, wouldn't it have been more effective to send an assassin rather than a messenger? Hey, I'm not Jezebel. Anyway, so Elijah hears this word, right? Word somehow comes to him. He gets the word, and what does he do? Our man of God, our mighty prophet, our powerful warrior, our conqueror of fear, what does he do? He fears. Yeah, he runs. It's like actually kind of shocking. If you read it, you're like, wait a second, what? But I think the reality is Elijah is a person, just like us, and someone has just made a threat on his life. He really thinks Jezebel is going to kill him. But I think it's more than that. You see, ever since we met Elijah, ever since he's been in ministry, he's been on the run. He's had to live in hiding. He's been government enemy number one. And now, finally, literally after years of being in hiding, he gets to come out of hiding and demonstrate for everyone that Yahweh is God. It's like he thinks, yes, my job is finally done. I can finally live out in the open, and I don't have to crawl around hiding anymore. And like the very next day, he's back on the government hit list. And I think Elijah is angry. I think he's frustrated. I think he's depressed. And so he runs. In fact, the text says he runs for his life. Before he went outside of Israel to the north, to Zarephath, this time he goes outside of Israel to the south, some 100 miles away. Now, maybe that doesn't seem like very far, but when you're running, kind of a long distance. He leaves his servant there in the city, and then he heads out by himself into the wilderness, about a day's journey, finds a tree, and just sits down under the tree. And like it's at this point that he's ready to give up, throw in the towel. He's done with this ministry junk, right? Like, yeah, I did not sign up for this. This is not what I thought my life would be like. And then he finally says it, too much, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my father's. I don't know if you've ever been there, just feeling like life is too much. You did not expect the things to happen that happened, and you are just frustrated and angry and depressed. Some studies say that 25% of 13 to 18-year-olds report feeling depressed. That same study shows that also 50% of 13 to 18-year-olds report that they feel lonely, like they don't have anyone that they can talk to. And like I would say that's true from my experience, like just from conversations I've had and people I've interacted with, like people are so lonely. Even though we're more connected than ever, it feels like we're more disconnected than ever. It's so easy to feel like I am by myself, that no one understands, no one sees, no one knows what it's like to be me. And maybe that's you even this morning. Maybe you're good at hiding it so people don't know that's where you're at, but if I can just speak a word to you this morning, hear this. You are not alone. I know you might think you are, but the chances are actually really good that someone sitting on either side of you right now has struggled with some of the same things. You may be really having a hard time, really struggling, feeling really depressed, that no one knows what it's like to be you and to go through what you've gone through, but you're not the first person to feel that. Other people might be going through that same thing right now. So many others in history have been through this before. Even great people of faith, like Elijah, struggled with some of these same exact things. You are not alone. So what happens with Elijah? Well, he's sitting there under the tree, and he's asleep. And then something powerful happens. I don't want you to miss this. God meets him. Right there in his darkness, God meets him. Notice what it says. Behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. An angel just shows up in the middle of the desert and bakes Elijah a meal and then shakes him awake. Hey buddy, time to eat. Can you imagine what that would be like? I wonder what Elijah was thinking. He wakes up and rubs his eyes wait a second, what? And so what does Elijah do? Well, he ate and drank and lay down again. Really? But maybe, he was after the ravens, I've seen weirder. Just goes back to sleep. And then it happens again, right? The angel of the Lord appears a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. Now, Elijah doesn't seem to have said he's going anywhere, but I think God knew that the journey was coming. And he prepares him in advance for what will come down the road. A lot of times God does that, sometimes without us even realizing it. And so Elijah gets up and he eats and drinks, and then it says, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Now, I'm sure he stopped to take a break, but it certainly seems like he just ate this food, and that's it for 40 days and nights. Give me some of that. These 2 meals were enough to fuel him this whole way. God provided what he needed. But why does Elijah go all that way? Why to Horeb, of all places? I mean, he's already 100 miles away from Jezebel. Why would he go all the way, almost to Egypt? Well, I think it's actually because of a guy named Moses. You remember hearing about him. He's the guy who God called to lead his people out of slavery, lead them to the promised land. And there's lots of parallels between Elijah and Moses, more than we have time to go into this morning. But you know where the journey really started, the call really came for Moses? It was at Horeb. That's where God showed up. That's where God called him to save the people of Israel. And I think Elijah, here at a much later point in Israel's history, wants to go back to the beginning. And he wants to talk to the God who started it all and give him a piece of his mind. So Elijah flees all the way to Horeb, and then once he gets there, he finds a cave. And he goes in, and he sits down. What do you do when you finally get to the place where you've been heading? You sit down, you wait, and there, in the midst of the darkness, sits our prophet. Have you ever been in a cave? I'm not talking about an actual cave. Have you ever been in one of those really, really dark places where you're all by yourself and you're just sitting lonely with all of your junk around you? You know what happens? Once again, God shows up. Listen to what it says. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah. It met him right there in the middle of the cave, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, I know it's hard to read tone when we're reading the Bible, but I actually don't think this is an angry question. I think this is God actually just speaking heart to heart with Elijah. What's up with you being here? What's on your heart? What's on your mind that brings you all the way to this point? And my guess is right now, maybe even in this moment, God's asking you that same question. What's on your heart? What's on your mind? You know, before our family moved to the Middle East, we were super excited about all of the things we were going to get to do. We're super excited about the relationships we were going to build and the hope we were going to be able to talk about. And then we arrived in the country, and 2 months later, the country sort of erupted into this political chaos. I mean, there were protests in the streets on an almost daily basis, just disorder everywhere. I mean, at first it was really crazy, but after it goes on for a month, and 2 months, and 3 months, and 4 months, it just kind of becomes a regular part of life. And so we build these relationships with these people, and we'd start to talk about deeper, more significant things, and then the conversation would always turn to the political situation, to who was in power, to the things that were going on in the country. I mean, no matter how deep we would get, it always seemed to go there, and it was frustrating. Like after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years being there, we wanted our relationships to be farther along than they were, but all we were talking about was the political situation. I mean, work was also hard, family stuff was also hard. It was hard to live on the other side of the world from all of these people that we cared about and loved deeply. We missed our family and friends. Cats were peeing on our stuff. Our water tanks were exploding. Ah! In that third year, man, I went through a season where I was angry and frustrated, and I would walk out to this dirty little stretch of beach there near our house. I'd just walk out to the beach, and there were some rocks there on the beach, and I'd sit down. And man, there on that beach, I'd talk to God. Sometimes I'd just kind of let him know what was going on. Sometimes I'd get pretty angry. I'd let him know that I thought it was a pretty bad idea that he'd brought us all the way there to do this thing. I couldn't believe he'd have the nerve to do the things that he had us do, to drag our family across the world. There are other times I just sit there and cry. Just weep. And sometimes I just sit there and not say anything at all. It was my cave. And you know what? I'm not sure that ever in any of those moments, God sent a bolt of fire from heaven to point me back to the right path. I'm not sure there was ever a moment when God said something that just changed my whole perspective. But you know what happened? God showed up. He was there, sitting with me on the rocks. And there in the midst of my cave, in the midst of my darkness, God's presence, that was what sustained me. I know some of you guys are in a cave today. And maybe you want to give up. Maybe you feel like no one understands. Maybe you want to keep it inside and never tell anyone. But can I just speak this to you this morning? God is meeting with you there. In the midst of the darkness, in the midst of your cave, he is there. And man, I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes even though we know the truth, we actually have to tell it to ourselves over and over again until we start to believe it. So that's what we're gonna do, okay? I'm gonna say a phrase and then I want you to repeat it. When I despair, he will sustain. It's do it again. When I despair, he will sustain. Do you believe it? Let's say it together. When I despair, he will sustain. Again, when I despair, he will sustain. Again, when I despair, he will sustain. God, thank you for meeting us in the midst of our darkness. Lord, will you help us to cling to the hope that you are there, to trust that it's your power alone, that sustains us. Amen.